Hi folks, welcome back. Thank you for watching. Please do hit subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really does help when you do that. So today, welcome to part 2 of the Celestion and Fane comparisons. Now in part 1 I compared the lovely Fane Ascension A60 here to the Celestion AlNiCo Cream. And as we heard in that video, yes there are some differences between them, but in the grand scheme of guitar speakers they were fairly equivalent. Now today I'm going to be putting the A60 alongside the AlNiCo Gold, which is known as being a very bright, aggressive sounding speaker. And as we heard in my original demo of the A60 and the Cream comparison, this speaker isn't overly aggressive in the mid-range, so I'm expecting to hear a few more substantial differences between the Gold and the A60 than we did the Cream. But in terms of power rating of these speakers, this is the most equal of the 3 demos I'm going to be making, because in the first video this is a 60 watt speaker being compared to a 90 watt speaker, whereas today it's going to be compared to a 50 watt speaker. So 50 and 60 watts is fairly equivalent. So hopefully, as we heard in that first video, the Cream sounded slightly louder than the A60. Today we should get some answers as to whether that was down to the power difference or the fact this was a much younger speaker. So hopefully this video will help us work that out a little bit. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing today as I did in that first video. A few different sounds with a few different guitars, some lower gain stuff, some higher gain, bit of lead playing, some different shaped overdrive pedals, some mid pushed, some mid scooped, maybe a fuzz, and just put these speakers alongside each other so we can hear pretty fairly exactly what the similarities and differences between them are. So without further ado guys, let's get going. there we are, folks. Now, please do comment underneath, let me know what you thought of those speakers. I love chatting nerdy guitar stuff with you guys in the comments section. But as predicted, there was a fairly big difference between those two speakers, wasn't there? Now, the two main things I was hearing, in the first comparison video with the AlNiCo Cream, we found that the A60 sounded slightly quieter, and I was wondering whether that was down to the power rating difference, or the fact that the Cream was a good few years old and had a fair few miles on the clock, whereas the A60 is fairly new. It's broken in, but it's, you know, had much less use. Now, today, comparing the A60 to the Gold, I think that difference was even more apparent. The Gold sounded a fair bit louder than the A60 in most of those little excerpts. And I think we can fairly conclusively say now, because those two speakers are much more equal in terms of power rating, and they have exactly the same sensitivity rating of 100 dB, that Gold has been in that amp since it was made back in 2013. So it's been used a lot. It's definitely kind of broken in and loosened up, whereas the A60 is only a couple of months old, as I said, and it's had significantly less use than that. So I think that's what we can fairly, you know, safely say about these speakers, is the fact the A60 sounds a little bit quieter than the Celestions is just down to the fact it's much younger, and the mechanical parts over time loosen up even more than they already have, and they just sound a bit more dynamic and lively with a bit more volume. Now, the second and probably most obvious difference was the EQ. The Gold is a much brighter speaker than the A60. The A60 is fairly kind of flat and controlled in the mid-range in a nice way, whereas the Gold is much more pronounced. And like I did in the first video, I've taken the frequency response graph provided by Celestion for the Gold and overlaid it with what Fane provide for the A60. And we can very clearly see that in the data. So the A60 was again a little bit thicker low down, a bit more barky in the sort of low mid frequencies. But as soon as we get to like 2K upwards, there's about a 10 dB difference between the two. So they are very, very different speakers. The Gold is much brighter with much more kind of clarity and presence than the A60. But as before, it very much depends on what situation you're running it in and your preferences on tone. So if you're using it in a bright amp with a bright guitar and you're using a lot of heavy gain, you might like that kind of flatter mid-range of the A60. If you're using a dark amp with a sort of, you know, high output humbucker and you want a bit more clarity, then you might like that extra brightness and sort of mid-range of the Celestion Gold. So there is no better in any of this, it's just a comparison. So please do let me know what you thought below. I love hearing your opinions on all these sorts of things. So thank you ever so much for watching, folks. In the last part, I'm going to be comparing the 60 watt A60 to the 15 watt Celestion AlNiCo Blue. So it's a very different sort of power rating there, but the Blue is arguably the most famous of the Celestion speakers. So it's a worthwhile comparison to do. So thank you for watching, folks. I hope this video was interesting and useful for you. Please do carry on subscribing. It really does make a big difference when you do that. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.